Hello, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be speaking about the new Hellraiser movie that has been recently released on Hulu. This technically is the 11th installment in the Hellraiser cinematic franchise, but it is also considered to be a reboot as the original series has been pretty much run into the ground after the second installment. I have to say that I'm certainly a fan of the first two movies from the original series, and I will be referring to them in this video simply as original movies. I still remember how disturbed and shocked I was by the visuals of those movies when I first saw them, but also how captivated the overall setting and the ideas behind it were. So a quick spoiler-free review of this new Hellraiser. There are some similarities between this reboot and the original movies. A rather weak plot is compensated with what seems to be a clear and devoted vision of the core idea, the Cenobites. This reboot can be easily split into two parts that constantly interchange the main plot set in the real world and the otherworldly Cenobite interactions. The two could not have been more different, not only in their realism but also in their execution. The feeling I have after watching this movie is that its creators had a clear vision and appreciation of the Cenobites. This is also demonstrated by how carefully every scene they are present in is treated. All the interactions, actions, and visuals, everything shows care, attention, and vision. While the rest of the movie feels somewhat forced, as if it has to exist simply as a stepping stone to get to the juicy parts. The plot is silly, and the motivations are very poorly thought through. If we once again compare this with the original films, there we don't have quite as much Cenobite interaction. Every time we see them appear on the screen, it's barely enough to get the imagination going and leaves you wanting more. And the Cenobite-less part of those movies was much better written and acted out. Some characters had somewhat better motivations and were primed to pay for their sins, while others were terrorized and immersed in a thriller setting. This reboot takes an easy way out and puts about 10% of the effort into the main story and 90% into the Cenobite interactions. One can say that Cenobites are now properly positioned as the main plotline, while the real world is secondary and amorphous. And speaking of Cenobites, they have a lot of screen time in this movie. They are given so much care and attention, and it's absolute joy that something like this gained enough support and funding to be released in 2022. There is no holding back when it comes to Cenobites. It is as gory and disturbing as it can, or rather needs to be. And for this alone, this movie is a definite must-watch for the fans of this genre, the novel or the original movie fans. While for the rest, if you are looking for a proper Spooktober watch, Hellraiser 2022 will not disappoint. Now onto the spoiler part of this review. Let's start with the bad. I would say that anything happening in this movie that doesn't directly involve Cenobites is crap. It's poorly written, the actors do not invoke any compassion from me, and the writing is just laughable. The main idea is that there is a super rich and powerful gentleman who's simply bored and obsessed with finding the ultimate experience. Or at least he thinks he is. So he finds out there are these puzzle boxes that have stages to them and demand sacrifices to progress through the stages. Each stage also represents a choice, and there are 6 of those. First, Lament, or Life, is the default configuration where the cube, well, looks like a cube, and seems to be a regular way out. You simply choose to be left alone, no reward, nothing. Second stage, Lore, or Knowledge. The movie doesn't explain much about this option, but I would expect it to be the same kind of knowledge as the experience configuration is. Disturbing, otherworldly, knowledge that will make the one choosing it go insane. Third, Lodorant, or Love. Once again, we don't see much of this in the movie, but I would expect this is a variation of Lust. So think erotica with a Cenobite twist. Fourth, Liminal, Sensation or Experience. This is what Mr. Void originally chose. The name of this configuration, just like all the others, leaves a lot of room for interpretation. Sensation can be caused by pain as much as pleasure, and that's what gets Mr. Void. Fifth, Lazarus or Resurrection, though this movie does not show this option in action, as Riley chooses not to resurrect her brother after seeing the perversion of the liminal configuration. We sort of know how it works from the original movies, and Riley was right. Probably a resurrection of that kind will leave its subject far from the normal or expected state. Sixth and final configuration, the Leviathan, or Power. This is what Pinhead chooses for Void on his second try, while in the original second movie, Leviathan represented the ruler of the underworld and the Cenobites. In this case, Void seems to be getting turned into one of them. There is a number of ways this can be interpreted as. For example, you gain the power over others, or you are now part of the ultimate power, or you are now a subject of Leviathan's judgment and thus judging others. And speaking of power, I don't like that Cenobites are being practically manipulated in this movie. This Void gentleman needs to simply trick others to play with the cube and sees them being taken by Cenobites. If my memory serves me well, the original film specifically made a point about Cenobites not wanting to be manipulated and not taking those who were tricked or forced to use the cube to summon them. This made the original film's writing a bit better. The cube was something mysterious and desirable, yet potential gains were behind suffering and torture, and the Cenobites could not be easily tricked. This is a consistent theme of this new interpretation of Cenobites and the cube. It's more straightforward, clear, and predictable. The Cenobites are not difficult to comprehend, and they seem to have only one prime goal and motivation, and the box has a freaking massive spike sticking out of it whenever it's ready to take another victim. Anyway, this film decided not to bother itself with such complex ideas. As we'll learn later on, Mr. Void eventually got his original wish and was granted the ultimate experience that turned out to be unending torture and living nightmare. It is sort of poetic, because he chose to use others to progress the cube's stages. He did not know what kind of experiences the cube was offering. So he was probably thinking that the ultimate experience was going to be something he desired, but alas. Even though the torture Mr. Void was subjected to was arguably of the worst kind imaginable, it was also supernatural, so he continued to live with it. And his new plan was to repeat the cube cycles and be presented with the options once again and stop his sensation. But for some reason, instead of using his wealth to throw more parties and lure more victims into his cube web, pun intended, he instead locks himself up within the mansion and builds an elaborate structure closely covering his entire house. As we later learn, that is a cage he intended to use to keep Cenobites hostage until they free him from his torment. This is silly on so many levels. First, he saw time and time again that when Cenobites arrive, the material structures get manipulated and twisted. We can also see this during this movie when Riley's victims get taken. So building a cage is a really stupid idea. You won't be able to keep them in or out. And though visually I find the cage quite interesting, it is ultimately meaningless. And second, his plan was to lock the cube up in a storage container until someone decides to rob it, all while he continually suffered from unending torture. Stupid, that is just plain stupid. However, how Void is reintroduced when chasing one of Riley's friends inside a wall, a wretched, stumbling and haunting thing chasing the poor girl, and during that scene we only see his silhouette, so we do not yet know or understand what is that thing in his chest. A fabulous scene that is only slightly spoiled by that silly dagger sticking out of the cube. Speaking of Riley and her group, the characters are really plain and offer nothing to deserve viewers' investment. Riley is a troubled young lady that seems to be lost in drugs and alcohol, though for no clear reason. Her brother seems to be willing to take care of her, yet is a stereotypical controlling father-like figure. Her boyfriend seems to have no background or motivation whatsoever. It is not clear why he decides to break into the Void's storage container with Riley and why he has such a nice apartment. and the rest of the group has so little going on for them that it's not even worth talking about them individually. And as for Riley herself, her character is supposed to be the driving force behind the entire movie, and though the character does what she's supposed to be doing, it rather looks like a puppet going through motions than a deeply troubled real human being whose life rapidly spirals out of control and into the dark depths of madness and hell that is ruled by creatures of horror. Towards the end of the movie, I found myself rooting for Cenobites and rejoicing whenever they added more humans to their tally. And speaking of Cenobites, they are a bit plainer and more one-dimensional than the original interpretation. These Cenobites seem to be interested in one and one thing only, the experience or sensation, and taking it to the next frontier. This makes them less scary and somewhat diminishes their overall presence. Whenever you saw Pinhead and his retinue appear in the original movies, the striking visual was enhanced by the gravitas of his being. Pinhead was somewhat considerate and seemed to have the power to decide and judge. The new interpretation of Cenobites has them depicted practically as ultimate henchmen. Their visual interpretation is more striking yet more plain at the same time. In the original movie, each Cenobite had a clearly indicated perversion and distinct tortured transformation, while the rest of their body was covered in leather. This time around, Cenobites' entire bodies are representative of their sins and faults. Their skin is twisted into ornamentation too. This does make their appearance more assaulting, yet the original interpretation had a layer of sexuality or unknown, represented by the leather and what it left unseen. So Cenobites not only get a new look, we also get to see more of them, and Pinhead is quite good within the confines of her character. The actress did a great job in acting out the character, but once again she was tasked with playing a puppet within extremely limited freedom of action, but she still did a good job of that. Pinhead's goal seems to be torture, and she might only go as far as selecting a method, but she cannot choose not to take the target. In the meantime, the way she uses other Cenobites as hounds and seems to take great pleasure in playing with her victims is quite entertaining. Ultimately, as I said already, these Pinhead and Cenobites are overall less scary or daunting, as they are puppets rather than judges, so you always know what to expect of them. And speaking of other Cenobites, they are expected to be hounds, so you only need to make them aggressive, determined, and scary as all hell. I'm happy to say they've succeeded in doing that in this movie. The sound of a Cenobite alone is often enough to plunge their victim and the viewer into an absolute horror and chills respectively. If anything, this movie is worth checking out to enjoy the visual interpretation of Cenobites. I was properly uncomfortable when the breather, or at least that's what I call him, made his first appearance, and the feeling was only exaggerated later towards the end of the movie. You will find yourself being both revolted and intrigued by their appearance. That is a great combination for Cenobites. There is a consistent tone, theme, and great attention to detail. This leads me to believe the creators of this movie had the visual aspects pretty well defined, and the rest of the movie is there simply to render this vision on our screens as a movie. It makes the movie, though, a bit more literal and plain, and I'm pretty sure Cenobites are supposed to have a bit more depth to them, but it's still pretty good, and you most certainly can explore more complicated matters in consecutive movies. And speaking of that, let's wrap this review up. This film is most certainly worth checking out. It is a decent restart to the franchise. I would say this new approach puts Cenobites first and the material world second, which should open up the storyline to further continuation, expansion, and exploration of more complex and ambiguous aspects of Cenobites. And if this new storyline is going to continue, I wish there is more depth to Cenobites to make them not only physically but also mentally menacing. I want the visual horror to be multiplied by mental dilemmas. I hope you find some time to enjoy this movie, and I look forward to reading your thoughts on it in the comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this video, drop a like, and if you already did, subscribe. That is all I have to speak of today. Goodbye.